Today I want to explore the Japanese design philosophy of Wabi Sabi. And I'm bringing this up under identity, non-Western identity, because it's really, the antithesis, the opposite of what we see in the Western world. Our fast fashion or designs that come and go, IKEA and other stores that bring us new designs but expect us to change them on a regular basis. Wabi Sabi is based in entirely different principles. In a few words, one could say that Wabi Sabi is the beauty of imperfect things. This is being able to look at an object and appreciate it not just for its form and its perfection, but for its imperfection. Of course, that would be overly simplistic in terms of an explanation for such a deep and profoundly rooted notion in the Japanese spirit. Something between an artist's concept, a philosophy of life, and a personal feeling. Wabi Sabi is everywhere in Japanese culture. Two primary observations about the Japanese cultural tradition are going to be relevant here and in the arts. First, classical Japanese philosophy understands reality as constant change, or, to use a Buddhist expression, impermanence. The second observation is that the art in Japan has tended to be closely connected with Confucian practices of self-cultivation or self-improvement. To this day, it is not unusual in Japan for the scholars to be a fine calligrapher and an accomplished poet, in addition to possessing the pertinent intellectual abilities. Translation: the more advanced you are in any given area within Japan, the more you're going to focus on self-cultivation. And self-cultivation is going to be just as much in the arts as maybe in the STEM fields. It's about improving yourself and rounding yourself out. Now, my goal here is to explore a particular aspect of Japanese culture and aesthetics, to present you with an antithesis to modern Western life, and open your eyes to new ideas only found in so-called non-Western cultures. And I say so-called because the term non-Western is problematic. It compares everything to the West, and that's a problematic framing, but not what I'm going to get into here. Just be aware that it's there. So when we're looking at Wabi Sabi, it's going to appreciate things that are old, that are imperfect, that have a story to them. They don't feel the need to replace or repair everything. So let's give you some context here on Japan. Of course, Japan is an island archipelago, making travel and communication difficult throughout, which means you get areas of slightly different culture. Now, we're used to seeing this in different places. Think of the United States. California is very different from Georgia. But in this case, because it's a primarily island nation, we see a greater extent of that isolation. However, that isolation does not apply to other cultures. Japan is constantly trading with China, with Korea. And at the same time, they don't really have to be concerned about military invasion. How can these two things coexist? Well, if I'm in China, sending a trade mission that might have 3 or 4 ships to Japan is a very different idea than sending several hundred ships for an invasion. The Sea of Japan is particularly difficult and stormy. It's a long crossing. 4 ships will make it. A few hundred probably won't. But this results in a hybridization of ideas, and without the threat of invasion, culture can be the focus of their lives and can flourish. By the way, we can arguably say that we see the same thing in England for many of the same reasons, or in Hawaii or other island nations. Now, of course, Japan does not begin as Buddhist. Now, Buddhism, of course, will become a major division within Japanese history, and therefore is used to divide the early history of Japan. Before this, it is going to be Shinto. But for the period that we're looking at, we're focusing on Buddhist Japan. Now, in Shinto, for example, we see this idea of an emphasized harmony of natural beauty and a poetic appreciation of reality. Natural events are considered to be manifestations of heavenly energy. And we have this idea of the kami and personal cleanliness, taking care of things. Ultimately, Shinto is a natural, an agricultural philosophy. I don't like saying faith because that doesn't quite capture it, but philosophy in which one looks at the world and understands the need to conserve it, to preserve it, to maintain it for future generations. Something that makes a lot of sense if you happen to be on an island nation with limited resources, where conservation is going to be key. After all, look at what happens on Easter Island, where they managed to deforest the entire island, or the Italian peninsula, where the Romans do the same. So when we're getting to Buddhist Japan, what we're looking at is a new tradition. In 552, we are told that a Korean leader sends a Buddha along with sutras to the emperor. And this marked the beginning of the Asuka period. Japan's elite began to embrace Chinese and Korean culture. And this will include the embrace of Confucianism and Buddhism. Confucianism looking at self-enlightenment, Buddhism very much the same thing. By 684, a centralized government formed, bringing with it the Nara period. And at this point, Buddhism will be well established, but never entirely displaces Shinto. And what you need to understand is that you can belong to different quote-unquote religions, different understanding of the term, in the East. You can be Buddhist and Shinto. You can be different faiths, because many of them operate more as philosophies than they do as faiths. But this brings us to Zen Buddhism, which is a specifically Japanese version based on Northern Chan Buddhism from China, which gets it from India. Now, what comes out of India is not entirely based on meditation, not the same way that we see in Northern Chan and consequently in Zen Buddhism. So what is Zen? Zen comes to prominence along with two other forms of Buddhism known as Pure Land and Esoteric. Pure Land is this idea of Buddhism with a savior or sort of a heaven, and Esoteric Buddhism, which is another form. Zen focused on rigorous discipline and self-responsibility. This, of course, will attract warrior classes such as the samurai, who believed behavioral codes and focused on loyalty, courage, and self-control were of particular importance. Zen also focused on superior knowledge and refinement, thereby legitimizing the elevated status of the warrior elite. Zen temples became centers of secular learning. And let me just talk briefly about those Zen meditations that you've heard about. The idea of a Zen master trying to pass from mouth to ear, in other words, nothing is ever written, a teaching. And what they'll do is they'll say, okay, meditate. But if you've ever sat down and just tried to meditate, you know that's incredibly difficult unless you're given some form of direction. And so they'll ask you something. What is the sound of a single hand clapping, for example? And the idea is not that you're going to come up with an answer. There is no answer. It's a trick question. What it is a stepping off point. You consider this idea, you think about it, you twist it, you play with it, which will bring you to other ideas, which you can use to explore what's going on in your mind. Understand what that train of thought is and what it's doing. What sort of things are you thinking about? It has nothing to do with the question and everything to do with understanding what's going on in your mind. But now I've dealt with philosophy, I've dealt with religion. Let's talk about Wabi Sabi. Wabi Sabi is actually two ideas. They're brought together. Wabi, this idea of freedom from attachment, this idea of sort of subtle profundity, and Sabi, austerity, asymmetry. And where the two come together are simplicity, tranquility, which is misspelled there, and naturalness. So let's explore this a little further. In Japan, Wabi Sabi is imperceptible, but everywhere. A crack in a teapot, the wood of an old door, green moss on a rock, a misty landscape, a distorted cup, or the reflection of the moon on a pond. Wabi Sabi can be defined as the intuitive appreciation of ephemeral beauty, ephemeral meaning temporary. So the intuitive appreciation of temporary or ephemeral beauty in the physical world that reflects the irreversible flow of life in the spiritual world. In other words, everything gets old, everything dies. We tend not to accept that in the West. We try to stay young, we try to stay youthful, we use all sorts of creams and powders and drugs and everything else. Whereas, according to Wabi Sabi, you must appreciate the age of things. You must appreciate the act of aging. We're all going to go through it. And by accepting it, it arguably would make one happier. Now, in terms of relation to landscapes, objects, and even human beings, the idea of Wabi Sabi can be understood as the appreciation of a beauty that is doomed to disappear, or even an ephemeral contemplation of something that becomes more beautiful as it ages, fades, and consequently acquires new charm. We've all seen things where as they age, they become more beautiful. Wabi Sabi is basically putting that into words, into a philosophy. Now, the term Wabi Sabi is actually composed of two characters. The second part, Sabi, is said to date back to the 8th century and refers to the delightful contemplation of what is old and worn. It was also used to talk about beauty in terms of that which is faded, or withered, or aged. Finding beauty in the elderly, finding beauty in a plastered wall that hasn't been in any way repaired, because that's nature coming through. And so you're seeing sort of a natural process, arguably a divine process, depending on your spirituality and your belief system. Sabi can also mean old and elegant, or being rusty with an untranslatable impression of peacefulness. This kind of makes it a little bit tricky. Wabi, on the other hand, only appeared in the 15th century to designate this new aesthetic sensibility, closely related to the tea ceremony, which of course we're going to have to talk about, but we'll get there, which referred to the general atmosphere and to the objects used during this formal service. The definition of wabi can be traced back to loneliness or melancholy. It's an appreciation of a serene life, far from the urban hustle and bustle. And I should point out, this isn't necessarily the appreciation of depression or what in the West we would understand as loneliness, although that can be part of it. It's really more an appreciation of serenity, an appreciation of quiet, an appreciation of one spending a serene moment on their own. Obviously, that's very different from the Western impression of loneliness. So the term Wabi Sabi is still difficult to translate. This is sort of the best we can do in terms of understanding. For Japanese people, Wabi Sabi is a feeling rather than a concept that can be found in classical Japanese aesthetics. For example, flower arrangement, literature, philosophy, poetry, tea ceremony, Zen gardens, and other places. Wabi Sabi goes against contemporary overconsumption, but also encourages simplicity and authenticity in all things. Here we see two examples. On the left, what you see is classic Wabi Sabi design. Everything is simple and minimal. They have nothing that they don't need. It's not about the value of a thing or how much of a thing they have. It's about simplicity. Because simplicity in the home leads to simplicity in the mind, which means your mind can contemplate other things because you don't have to worry about what's happening on the right, which is a giant closet full of clothes, which requires a lot more time to put all of that away and to organize it and to go out shopping and replace it. So Wabi Sabi is about simplicity in many ways, especially when compared to the West. Now, let's talk about origins of Wabi Sabi. This notion of Wabi Sabi is a feeling that has certainly always been part of Japanese sensibility. Its origin can be found in the story of Raku, the 16th century Zen monk who theorized the tea ceremony as is still practiced in contemporary Japan. And by the way, there are different versions of the tea ceremony. There isn't just one. There are longer versions, shorter versions, etc., but the principles are the same. Now, according to legend, the young Senuriku, eager to learn the codes of ancestral ritual of the tea ceremony as it existed before him, went to find a recognized tea master. The tea master wanted to test Senuriku's ability and asked him to take care of the garden. He would go out, he cleaned the garden from top to bottom and raked it until it was perfect. However, before presenting his work to his master, he shook a cherry tree, and the flower blossoms fell to the ground. This randomness, this organic beauty, this completely uncontrollable sense of that which is, well, ephemeral beauty, is what impressed his master. So this touch of imperfection brought beauty to the scene, and that's how the concept of Wabi Sabi is said to have been born. Now, Senuriku is still considered as one of the greatest, most influential tea masters in history. He would help to transform the tea ceremony as it was previously practiced with luxury utensils and exuberance, and he would change it into a refined ritual, which is what it is. The tea ceremony is not about the implements. It is about control and discipline, about doing things properly and in order, so that one can better understand and better appreciate those simple elements that are going into it. From this simplicity of the objects and the minimalistic atmosphere of the tea room emanated a delicate beauty that cannot and could not be equaled. Here we see a picture of the oldest tea room in Japan. And all of those marks you see on those walls, that's all been there for hundreds of years. They only repair that which is structurally necessary. The roof, for example, has been repaired, but the walls have not. They let it age. They let time take its role, because as they see it, time is all around us. It is an element of nature and should be appreciated rather than fought against. By using imperfect objects, sometimes broken and repaired, in a room devoid of superfluous or extra items, Riku made the moment of tea tasting a true communion for the spirit, which was nourished by the following principles: harmony, purity, respect, and tranquility. This kind of ceremony is also referred to as wabi cha, cha being the Japanese word for tea. So, what is happening here? By using minimalistic elements, surrounding themselves with very little, suddenly all you can do is concentrate on two things: the people around you and the tea. Everything else to Senriku is going to be a distraction. Look around your own home. Maybe you see pictures or books or televisions or computers. And all of these are distractions from what arguably should be the most important thing, which is whoever's around you or whatever thing that you're doing. That is the ultimate act of mindfulness, is being in the moment and understanding what you are doing, what you are experiencing, what you are thinking. Nowadays, the most prestigious tea ceremonies are still carried out with teacups that are several hundred years old and often antique utensils. These are not several hundred years old. This is, but it gives you an impression of what they look like. In Japanese pottery, cups are often distorted and irregular because each object must be unique in order to have its own charm. There's no such thing as a matching tea set when it comes to the tea ceremony. That would defeat the entire purpose. Those tea sets that we see in the 16th and 17th century in Europe are coming from China, not Japan, at least not this tradition of Japanese tea. The imperfect beauty of Wabi Sabi is found in many other Japanese art forms. You can see this very clearly in popular styles of Japanese teaware, such as Raku pottery and elsewhere. So, let's get into Wabi Sabi in Japanese art. You know that I'm headed in this direction, but I have to start with context, and I have to start with some history. So, Wabi Sabi in Japanese art. Wabi Sabi is an artistic sensitivity as much as it is the ephemeral feeling of beauty. This picture, for example, there's a picture of a tree, and you sit there and go, well, it's a photograph, it's not really ephemeral, but the thing being contemplated is. It's a tree. It might be a dead tree, it might be a tree that's dormant in the winter. And what we're looking at is a moment in time, a moment that will never be repeated. That sky will never again match with this single position that the person is in taking the photo with those branches and that arrangement. Of course, branches will break and the tree will be affected by weather, etc. Wabi Sabi celebrates the passage of time and its sublime damages. In many Japanese art forms, this notion of prettiness through imperfection is going to be present. In literature, Wabi Sabi can take the form of haiku. Wait, haiku? Well, this ancestral art form is imbued with Zen philosophy. Traditional haiku, of course, consists of 3 sentences that comprise a certain unit. It has that 5-7-5 pattern. This form of codified poetry allows one to express the instantaneous beauty of a scene and therefore is appropriate to express the feelings of Wabi Sabi. Let me explain. Haiku has a very set model. You must have 5 syllables and then 7 and then 5. It's in a set pattern, which means when you experience ephemeral beauty, you don't have to think about the form it's going to take. You can simply express yourself. And that's the beauty of it. It creates spontaneity, even though it appears to be highly controlled. And that captures the ideas of Wabi Sabi in literature. We also see the shakuhachi, which I may be mispronouncing. This is a traditional Japanese flute that also embodies the ideas of Wabi Sabi. It boasts a simple structure, a rough bamboo pipe, open at both ends with 5 holes and a bottom end made from the root of the bamboo stalk. You can see at the ends there where the root would come out just above the ground for the stalk. And you'll notice that none of them are the same, which means they all sound different. They all appear different. And doesn't that really capture the world, especially if you're focusing on nature? Even if it seems unsophisticated, this instrument is nevertheless a work of art, a work of craftsmanship, and a work of engineering. Now, the music itself is generally played by Zen monks and is considered Wabi Sabi. And the interesting thing here is there's no such thing as a written piece for these instruments. These are all improvised. The closest thing we have in the United States would be jazz. I'm talking free jazz, where it's entirely improvisational. But this captures Wabi Sabi. If you aren't there to hear it in the moment, you will never again hear it. It's gone. It's ephemeral. It never will exist again. Now, since they live on land that is subject to the vagaries of earthquakes and tsunamis, the relationship that the Japanese have with nature is exceptional. We see that in Shinto. We see that in their arts. Consequently, it's not surprising that they respect nature as much as they fear it. And here I want to get into some of the individual Wabi Sabi art forms. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. This is, after all, a worldly arts course, and I'm just trying to give you an introduction to many of the ideas. Ikebana is one of many forms that we're going to look at here as we move through Wabi Sabi, and here we see an admiration which finds a form of representation, Ikebana, which encourages natural magnificence in its simplicity. Since Wabi Sabi defines beauty in its ephemeral nature, temporary, something that will pass on, something that will fade or change in some way, a single flower in a vase perfectly embodies this concept. And so the flower, of course, will look one way one day, but be very different even at the end of the day as it dries or dies or whatever is going to happen to it. Based on harmony between asymmetry, depth, and space, Ikebana brings out beauty of a pure floral composition. And here I want to take a look at this one. Now you'll notice, for example, that this is not symmetrical. That should be pretty clear. On the right, we have the branches running across, almost like lightning across a screen. On the left, we have those flowers, in this case, 2 large white flowers and then sort of a smaller grouping of flowers there, and a very simple vase-like structure. So, what is happening here? What they're doing is designing through simplicity. Simplicity is incredibly difficult to deal with. It always has been. After all, creating a simple symbol that people find beautiful or attractive or drawn to is incredibly difficult. If there's one error here, it's going to be very obvious. Whereas if there's one error in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling with 300 figures, you're probably not going to notice when he doesn't quite paint a fingernail right. So you see the difference. This takes concentration and effort. While it looks incredibly simple, it's something that is to be mastered, something that would have taken a great deal of time to learn and truly understand. And by understanding it, by being able to create it, you can also learn to appreciate it, to appreciate this natural, ephemeral, temporary beauty. Now, Ikebana is very similar to the next form, which is bonsai. Bonsai, of course, is the famous Japanese art of creating these miniature plants or miniature trees, often featuring textured wood, fragments of dead wood, and plants with hollow trunks, all aimed to emphasize the passing of time and the beauty of nature. So how does this work? Well, bonsai, for example, this plant may well be over 100 years old. And in this case, what they do is they trim and prune the plant. They train it around to this form. It's going to take a considerable amount of time. It's a very, very slow, methodical process. But they will also do things like trim the roots, because if you trim the roots, you can manage the size of the plant. That's also typically why you see fairly small pots for the bonsai plant that goes in them. And again, it's about something being temporary. It's about bringing nature and the impermanence of nature, the constant change of nature, into the domestic space, which is highly controlled and very much the opposite. Look around your apartment. It probably looks nothing like the woods. And yet we try to bring these things in. In the West, we bring in houseplants. And we do much the same thing. Now, we tend to just let them grow. We're not trying to control and manipulate, but we are bringing nature in. The difference here being, if this plant becomes sick, they will work with it and really constantly try to look for an answer and alter it, and in some cases just accept it and see what happens. Whereas in the United States, for example, we might take that house plant and throw it away because it's just not growing the way that we want it to. So there's a certain amount of unpredictability, and it looks highly controlled once again, but again, it's mastery. It's learning something that's going to take a great deal of time, reflecting self-cultivation, and learning something that's going to require patience to give us this sort of organic beauty, this beauty that we cannot create as humans. Even if you recreate it out of resin, it wouldn't be the same because, of course, it wouldn't be a living thing. But these two ideas, Ikebana and bonsai, will in part come from, and in part influence, the idea of Zen Gardens. Now, as mentioned above, the tea master Raku was able to express a feeling of Wabi Sabi by arranging a Zen garden. What could be more evocative than a garden where the ephemeral elements, green mosses, shrubs, fresh flower petals, and the immutable components, in other words, the permanent ones, raked sand and old stone, are harmoniously mixed, getting at this idea of the balance of life, that some things are temporary, some things will continue on well beyond us, and some won't. So Japanese gardens and their evolution over time and throughout the seasons show us countless illustrations of Wabi Sabi. Now this brings us back to a different period, the Muromachi period. So we're around just before 1400. And Zen Buddhism had come to prominence. Zen, of course, as we talked about, had focused on self-discipline, and their temples become centers of secular learning. And out of this period, we get the Zen Gardens. In the 14th century, this Pure Land temple, it was Pure Land Buddhist prior, will become a Zen Buddhist temple. However, the Zen Buddhists do not alter the temple. The two traditions actually complement each other. Pure Land provides salvation, while Zen promotes study and meditation. And there, they create these gardens, known as the Dry Cascade and Pools. The lower gardens feature a pond in the form of the character from mind or spirit. And the almost iridescent moss contrasts with the rocks and sand on the hill above. The Dry Cascade and Pools are treasured early examples of dry landscape gardening, known as Kare-san Sui, which I also may be mispronouncing. And gazing at this dramatic scenery was felt to be beneficial to the human spirit. Now let's look at this for a second. When it says dry cascade, what they're doing is they're using that iridescent green moss to come down the hill over the rocks and give the impression of a waterfall, which isn't actually there. And in fact, it gives the impression of a pool. And we know that there is a small pool there, in this case covered in algae, but it extends it. Makes it much larger. And I should point out, everything you see, every tree, every rock, every form that you see in this image was altered. It's landscaped. And we look at it and we say, no, that's not landscaped. Well, first of all, it was landscaped, about 600 years ago. So, things change. Things look more natural over time. But what they're trying to do is accentuate nature, not alter it. Well, they are altering it, but they're not trying to perfect it. They're trying to take it and improve it, I guess would be the best way to put that. And what they're trying to do is create an image, create a place that's going to make you meditative, that's going to draw the different elements together, those things that are alive and those things that are not, those things that are permanent and those things that will pass, all in one place. So that you see this balance. It becomes a very mindful, a very meditative space. And this idea, of course, is going to be a very powerful one. And even though it's very, very simple, moss, some simple grasses, some rocks, some trees, it's also very, very powerful. Because as we look at it, there's a lot to consider and contemplate. It is serene and quiet. It really does serve its purpose. Now, this will, of course, give way to the form increasingly popular that will develop, known as Zen Gardens. And we'll see this first at Zen temples and then developed into what we see today. And what we see here is that greenery, instead of using moss, they've used shrubberies. And instead of grass and short moss on the ground, they've replaced it with gravel, which is raked, the raking being a meditative or mindful practice, where the act of raking it is so mindless, yet mindful, that it puts one into a meditative state. And what we see is a balance. This, of course, will become these highly controlled gardens that we see today. This collection of rocks and raked white sand is so common. And the idea is to rake it anew every day. You can do different patterns into it. It's both thoughtful and mindless. It's the perfect meditative activity. Now, in some cases, there's more living things. In some cases, there's more permanent things. In this case, there's almost islands of life around the rocks, and yet the gravel is this sterile space. So the ideas of balance have changed, and the ideas of balance can change from garden to garden and time to time. But these are very powerful ideas of Wabi Sabi, of looking at impermanence, and in this case, looking very much at balance. Then we have kintsugi. Now, kintsugi is a very popular form today. It has taken off in popularity over the last 5 or 10 years, and is an old Japanese technique for repairing objects, which consists of mending the area of breakage with lacquer mixed with gold powder. And so you're actually highlighting the break, not hiding it. which is very interesting because if you were repairing a vase that you broke as a child, you were probably using clear glue and trying desperately to hide the fact that you broke grandma's priceless vase. Whereas here, you're actually accentuating the break. And there's a reason for it. So instead of throwing away the broken or damaged ceramics, this art gives a second chance to bowls, cups, or vases, which are embellished by this meticulous work. In some cases, they will take pieces, for example, there's a missing piece here, and they will break it and shape it from another vessel and put it into place. What they're doing is preserving the story of this single piece. It makes sense in a world where you need to conserve things because you're an island nation. You have to recycle the materials that you have. You can't just go out and dig up more clay and keep doing this because eventually you run out of clay. And so it's a very much sort of recycle, reuse sort of idea, but focusing on the history of the object. And so pieces can be broken multiple times. And of course, they do reach a point where you can't repair them. But until then, and keep in mind what we would do in the West. Oh, it's broken. We need to throw it away or use it for DIY with a hot glue gun and cement, which is apparently what they do. Not in Japan, but in the West, and it's disturbing, and it's a thing on Reddit. I don't ask. So, the focus here is on reuse and repair, and is related to the concept or avoidance of waste, which is of greater importance today than ever. And I should point out that the repaired pieces are used and continue to be used. This lacquer and gold is food safe, and so they can continue to work with it. Behind this practice, intricately linked to the notion of Wabi Sabi, lies a wish to celebrate the beauty of time passing, the history of an object, the fact that all things are linear, that all things will move in one direction, which is to advance. This pottery will never again be whole in the traditional sense once it is broken, so why hide it? Why not celebrate it? Kintsugi is also used as a metaphor of resilience by Japanese and Western health professionals. One may experience trauma, be damaged, and then be reborn, more beautiful or stronger. It takes on a metaphorical idea in certain areas of mental or medical health. This idea of piecing someone back together from what they were, making them more beautiful or appreciating them for the history rather than complaining about their past. Now, this also brings us into pottery, and I want to deal with a couple of different forms. We're going to be dealing with Shino Ceramics, but also Raku. We'll start with Shino. Now, Sanuriku is influential in developing the form of the tea ceremony utensils as well as the tea ceremony itself. He focused on the inherent beauty of an object, not monetary value. At this time, the appreciation of rustic wares from Japan and Korea were on the rise. So, of course, we're during the tea ceremony, during this period around Sanuriku. In this case, we're going to be in the 15th and 16th centuries. And the idea behind this is that these should be natural-looking forms, the sort of thing that you might find sitting in a stream or you might dig up from the ground. And, of course, we know that nature's not going to be perfect. And yet, despite the fact that in the West, we tend to think of perfection as the thing that tells us that an artisan is really well skilled, we have to keep in mind that perfection is not a human trait. And so in Shino, what they're doing is they're trying to create something that is intentionally altered to look accidental. Now think about that sentence for a second. How many times have you ever tried to do something random spots on a page, random numbers, etc.? It's incredibly difficult. The idea of trying to create an accident intentionally is incredibly difficult, whether it be in ceramics or painting or any other form. And yet they're doing it. And this means that rather than having monetary value for its perfection, it takes on an intrinsic value because that piece can never be recreated. Each one must be one of a kind. Now, in this case, we're going to focus on this tea ceremony water jar by Koga. The name means ancient stream bank and comes from the surface decoration and coarse surface overall. It's reminiscent of earth cut by water and is Shino style. Now, this piece is meant to look as if it's been sitting on a bank, and the reeds that you see there might be the impression of reeds that it sat on for a year as they decomposed and kind of altered it. We've all seen that. If you pick up a stone on a riverbank, you might see those marks where organic materials got underneath it. So here, the Shino is known for its rough surface and heavy glaze, generally a white glaze, but not always. And we have a similar aesthetic here and similar interpretive challenges to the dry landscape gardens that we saw earlier. So what the challenge is to create something made by human hands that looks organic and natural, that looks random, that looks, natural. And that's a real problem. It's really difficult to do. We're really good at making things look perfect, but it takes a master to make things look imperfect. Let's look at the water jar for a second. If you look up here in the back, you'll notice this big crack. How the heck do you intentionally crack a piece of ceramics? I mean, there are tricks to it, but if he just cuts it, for example, it's not quite going to work. You'll notice the lip is uneven and there are blowouts where part of the glaze and clay blew out due to an air pocket or some other element. And you have to start questioning, is that intentional, not intentional? When you look at the actual decoration, that's all in iron oxide, so basically rust powder painted onto the surface to give it that color that is very reminiscent of decomposing plants. The white and brown splotches give us that impression of age, and it's ceramic, so we know that it probably was or looked this way when it came out of the firing. And yet, it's got this nature to it. The crack and sagging seem here to be intentional, to suggest some kind of accidental and natural quality. This idea that it is not valued for its monetary value, but for its beauty, for its natural beauty. And again, the idea that this is an absolutely unique piece, just like the dry cascade garden is absolutely unique because it changes and alters over time. And what you're seeing is something ephemeral in that case. In the case of the tea ceremony water jar, what you're seeing is something that can never be recreated. You could be a master with 40 years of experience. You couldn't recreate that form perfectly. Now, there's a second idea here in terms of pottery known as Raku. And this is traditionally used in Japanese tea ceremonies. And it's a famous type of Japanese pottery. Now, this art form was highly appreciated by tea masters for the purity and unpretentiousness of the objects, especially chawan tea bowls. And these are really simple objects. This may be reminiscent for you of something, if you've ever thrown ceramics, of something that you created early on. It's a simple bowl with a simple glaze. It looks like something that could have been dug up from the earth rather than found on a riverbank. But at the end of the day, really similar ideas, similar aesthetic. Now, typical examples of raku ware are hand sculpted rather than thrown on a potter's wheel. They're lightweight, and they tend to be porous, adorned with many lead glazes. Now, porous, of course, can be a problematic situation if you're sitting there and filling it with water and leaving it filled with water. But if you're using it for a tea ceremony where you're drinking the tea in a fairly short time, it's not really a problem. And the porous nature of the ceramics mean that it's going to change over time, getting at the ideas of impermanence. In the traditional Japanese method, the sculpted object is briefly fired at low temperature, taken out from the high kiln at the peak of firing and allowed to cool in open air. And this, I should point out, bears absolutely no relation to the Western idea of raku, which is this metallic finish and you take it out of the kiln and you put it into straw and everything else. That's not what we're dealing with. Western raku is a whole different ball of wax. Japanese raku is simplicity. It would never have a metallic finish. That would be too pretentious. So here we're looking at a tea bowl by Shigeru. And Shigeru created bowls that were simple and without ornament, either entirely red or entirely black, glazed soft pottery, which was meant to reflect the ideas of wabi, beauty in its simplicity and its sobriety. A kiln firing would start at midnight and continue for 18 hours. Raku tea bowls are then exposed to variable elements in the natural state of the firing. It's a wood firing, so maybe it's close to a log, maybe it's further away, maybe it heats up unevenly. Everything is entrusted to the power of nature, highly present in much of Japanese culture. Raku pottery, is closely associated with the philosophy of Wabi Cha, the frugal and minimalistic tea ceremony, which arose in the extravagant Moroyama period. And so we're going to see Raku existing in a slightly later period after Senno-riku, but reflecting many of the same ideas of Wabi Sabi, just going in a slightly different direction. So let's talk about Wabi Sabi in daily life. We've talked about it in terms of aesthetics. Let's look at it in terms of philosophy and design and overall concept. The form is the material manifestation of an idea or concept through objects, their arrangement, or through sensations or sound. Now, I should point out, Wabi Sabi could mean living a life in a silent home where you try to avoid the hum of appliances or constant music. It could take form or take a number of different forms, any number of different sensations. Wabi Sabi happens. It arguably cannot be created. You can create an environment where it will appear or should appear, but you cannot guarantee it. In an interesting demonstration, you can compare the feelings of Wabi Sabi to a person who would fall in love with another person who is considered unattractive. The first person would perceive and appreciate the imperfect beauty of the second. In recent years, Wabi Sabi has been gaining recognition in the West, and there are numerous books covering the subject, although I should warn you that many of them will alter the subject and twist it to prove whatever point they have, frequently focusing on the ideas of minimalism, which are not entirely Wabi Sabi. So sometimes these things are problematic. As a sensitivity that can therefore lead to happiness, or to an acceptance of the beauty of simple and natural things, Wabi Sabi as a philosophy is applicable every day. It is a daily way to experience little joys, whether it be when admiring a landscape, an object, a painting, during a conversation with friends, or when sharing a moment with good company. Everyone can feel the notion of Wabi Sabi and think about those things. Let's take that moment with friends or with good company. That moment will never happen again. If we do not find a way to accept the beauty of that moment, then it's lost. And if you can't live in a world filled with that kind of simple beauty, and you focus on the complex and the perfect, on having the right things and the right forms, then that becomes problematic. It actually creates more stress as you have all of those things. You have to clean them, you have to maintain them, you have to do all sorts of things. So perhaps simplicity, not minimalism necessarily, but simplicity would be the key here. And it's even being able to look at things in nature. Of course, Wabi Sabi applies to nature as well. Finding a leaf as it degrades, as it breaks down and decomposes back into its elements. Finding a rock of particular beauty. Except the Wabi Sabi tradition would be to look at it, to appreciate it, and then to put it back. We don't collect everything that we find. So it's an interesting form. And it is very much an anti-Western form, not intentionally anti-Western. They don't look at the West and go, hey, that's just wrong. But it is a design idea, design principle that is so antithetical to the West that I find it particularly interesting to bring up in these situations, because it opens students' eyes to a whole different idea of design, a philosophy of looking at life. So let's kind of draw this all together. Let's look at where we started. Elusive and beautiful, Wabi Sabi is an integral part of Japanese life. It is impermanence. It is understanding and appreciating age. It is understanding the imperfect and appreciating the imperfect. And it makes a lot of sense because, as I've said once before, perfection is not a human trait. So why not embrace it to some level? Now, this is not to say that everything can be complete chaos, because it's not. This is really sort of curated aging. So there is a certain element of control, but a little, not too much. Omnipresent, it is the basis of the delicate Japanese sensitivity that is so often surprising to us. Seeing something as simple as this, a plate with a couple of rocks and a vase, and in this case, basically a stick with some leaves. And we would look at that in the West today and we would go, wow, let's put a lot more stuff there. But yet in its simplicity, there is beauty. And this makes a lot of sense, because if you are taught to live a simple life, then you will be able to conserve, which makes sense if you're in an island nation. Today, this notion deserves to be given more emphasis, since it encourages a return to the humble, to unpretentious values, to the basic elements of what it is to be human, of what it is to appreciate this short time that we have on this terrestrial sphere. At some point, you're going to shuffle off. At some point, you're going to kick the bucket. At some point, you're going to die, whatever term you want to use. So why not spend time seeing things as wondrous and beautiful rather than seeing things as contentious, difficult, or problematic? Why chase happiness in objects that will give us happiness for minutes, when by creating a philosophy and really living a philosophy wherein we find beauty all around us in simplicity? I mean, think about that. So I can chase the next great thing, or I can find beauty in simplicity, which means either I go broke buying the next phone and the next phone and the next phone and the next phone, or I learn to find beauty in the woods, or in my home, or in my dog, or in my plants, whatever it happens to be. It's a very powerful idea.